It was an ordinary Thursday evening at the Silver Spoon, a small, upscale restaurant tucked in the heart of the city. The clinking of silverware, the soft murmur of conversations, and the aroma of freshly prepared dishes filled the air. The warm lighting cast a golden glow over the polished wooden tables. And the waitstaff, each wearing a crisp black and white uniform, moved in synchrony, delivering plates with practiced precision. In the middle of it all was James, the only black waiter in a predominantly white establishment. James had worked at the Silver Spoon for nearly 5 years, ever since he had moved to the city from a small town in the south. The city, though large and bustling, had its own form of quiet segregation, and in his new job, James quickly learned that his presence as the only black employee in the restaurant was both a quiet challenge and a point of distinction. He was always polite, efficient, and unassuming, qualities that made him an asset to the restaurant and, over time, won him the respect of both his co-workers and regular patrons. Yet, beneath the surface, James knew that his race was a silent conversation topic among some customers. It wasn't that James didn't experience racism. It was there, subtle but persistent. Some patrons, when given the choice, would choose another waiter, a person with a lighter skin tone. He had seen their furtive glances when they glanced at him before turning away, but he didn't let it affect him. Years of experience taught him not to take it personally. Every day, James would come in with the same dedication, put the same genuine smile, and offering the best service possible. He had grown accustomed to the quiet prejudices, but always wore his dignity like a shield. That evening, the restaurant was full as usual, buzzing with the sound of conversation, clinking glasses, and the rustle of napkins being pulled from tables. James moved swiftly between the tables, balancing trays laden with appetizers and entrees, exchanging pleasantries with the regulars, and ensuring each guest felt like royalty. It was a well-oiled machine, and James was one of its most integral gears. Despite his position as just a waiter, he took immense pride in his work. He had learned to make small talk, remember names, and serve the food with a flourish, skills that elevated the mundane task of waiting tables into a craft. He had a regular customer named Helen, a woman in her late 50s who had been coming to the Silver Spoon for years. Helen wasn't like the other patrons. She wasn't interested in fancy displays or high society chatter. No, Helen came to the restaurant because she enjoyed the quiet sophistication, the elegance of a well-prepared meal, and the comfort of the familiar. Over time, James had grown to respect her for her quiet grace. Helen had been coming to the restaurant alone for years, sometimes in the company of friends or family, but more often than not, it was just her. She was a white woman, in a wheelchair, who had faced her own challenges in life. She had a disability, a result of a long-term illness that had confined her to a chair for nearly a decade. But Helen never complained, never sought pity. Instead, she came to the Silver Spoon, finding solace in the taste of good food, a comfortable environment, and the casual, unspoken bond she shared with James. As James looked over the bustling room, his eyes landed on Helen, who had just wheeled herself through the door. She smiled at him, the same warm, sincere smile she always gave him. She was having a tough day. He could tell. Her face showed the wear of a woman who had long battled both illness and the outside world's often condescending gaze. She struggled slightly with her chair as she rolled it over the threshold, and James was quick to make his way over to her. He helped her settle in, making sure her chair was comfortable, and she appreciated his gesture. As always, "You're looking well tonight, Helen," he said, flashing her his usual bright smile. He felt an odd sense of warmth whenever he served her, maybe because she never made him feel lesser or invisible, like so many others had done. Helen's smile widened in response, and she gave him a small chuckle. "I'm not sure about well, James, but I'm certainly here," she said, her voice light despite the hardships she'd endured. She took out her menu, and James stood back, waiting patiently for her to decide. Over the years, James had learned the ins and outs of Helen's preferences, her favorite wine, her ideal dish, even how she liked her soup served. He had memorized these small details, not just because it was his job, but because he truly cared. As he stood there, watching her scan the menu, he wondered how many people in her life treated her with the same level of consideration. The thought made him feel a pang of sadness. The world could be so harsh to people like Helen, those who struggled but never sought pity. After a moment, she looked up from the menu. "I'll have the salmon tonight," she said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. She always picked the salmon, but James didn't mind. There was something comforting in the routine, the fact that, in a world that was ever-changing and unpredictable, some things stayed the same. "Of course, Helen, I'll get that for you," James said with a nod, making his way to the kitchen to place the order. As he passed the kitchen staff, he could hear the quiet hum of the restaurant's operations, the sizzling of food on hot plates, and the chatter of cooks calling orders to one another. Everything felt normal, as it always did on nights like these. But as the night wore on, something about the atmosphere shifted. James couldn't quite place it. Perhaps it was the lingering tension in the air or the way the customers seemed to hurry through their meals, eager to leave. Something felt different, though he couldn't put his finger on it. The hum of the restaurant was still there, but it was quieter now, as if everyone were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. When James returned to Helen's table, he noticed that she was quiet, lost in thought. She didn't seem to mind the delay as he placed her meal in front of her. And for a brief moment, they shared a look, a shared understanding of the quiet, unspoken things that happen in life, things that didn't need words. As he left to attend to other tables, he noticed Helen wasn't eating. She seemed lost in her own world, her hands folded on the table, staring off into the distance. The night went on, but for James, something inside him told him that this might be the last time he served Helen. The evening rush had passed, and the restaurant began to quiet down, the last few tables slowly emptying. James moved about the dining room with practiced grace, clearing plates, offering refills, and wiping down the tables. The clock on the wall read 9:45 p.m. He'd been on his feet for over 8 hours, and although his legs ached, there was a certain satisfaction that came from knowing he'd done his job well. The regulars had been satisfied, and the tips, although sometimes modest, always felt like a small acknowledgement of his hard work. Just as James was about to head to the back to begin cleaning, the doorbell above the entrance chimed. He looked up and saw the familiar face of Martha Wheaton, one of the restaurant's longtime customers. She was a woman in her late 50s, with graying hair tied back in a neat bun, her face lined with age and experience. Martha was a regular at the Silver Spoon, a fixture at the same table by the window, where she always ordered the roasted chicken and a glass of red wine. But there was something different about her tonight. She wheeled herself into the restaurant in her electric wheelchair, as usual, but she seemed a little slower, a little more weary than James had ever seen her. Martha had been coming to the restaurant for years, always polite, always smiling, but never engaging much beyond pleasantries. James had grown to like her over the years, not just because she was a steady customer, but because she seemed genuinely appreciative of the work he did. She would always say, "Thank you, James. You're always so kind." A simple compliment, but one that made him feel seen. It was a rarity in a place like this, where the staff often felt invisible to the customers. James immediately went to greet her as she approached the door. He had always been quick to help her with anything she needed, from holding the door open to making sure her chair was positioned just right. Martha had never asked for special treatment, but James always gave it to her anyway, not out of obligation, but because he saw her as someone who deserved respect. "Good evening, Ms. Wheaton," he said, his voice warm. "How are you today?" Martha gave him a tired smile, her eyes softening as she looked up at him. "Oh, I'm doing all right, James. Just tired. You know, been a long week, but I'm happy to be here. It's my little escape." James smiled, his face showing genuine warmth. "I'm glad you're here, too. Let me help you get settled." He gently moved her chair to her regular table, adjusting it to give her the best view of the outside. She always liked to sit by the window, watching the busy street as she dined in peace. James didn't ask if she needed anything else. He knew her routine well enough to anticipate what she wanted. As he was about to leave her with the menu, Martha reached out, her hand weak but firm as she grasped his wrist. James! Wait, she said, her voice softer now. I've been thinking about something for a while. I know you work hard. Always so hard. You've never made a fuss about it. But I can see it. I wanted to thank you. Really thank you for always being so kind to me. Even when I haven't always been the easiest person to serve. James was caught off guard. He had always appreciated Martha's politeness. But this felt different. He paused, looking down at her, unsure of how to respond. Ms. Wheaton, is no trouble at all. It's my job, he replied, modestly. Martha shook her head, a faint smile crossing her face. No, James, it's more than that. I know people like you don't always get the credit you deserve. And I've noticed that. I've noticed you. For years now. The way you work with patience. Grace. Even when others don't appreciate it. I see that. Her words were sincere. And James could feel the weight of them settle into his chest. He didn't expect to hear such appreciation from anyone. Especially not someone who, despite being a regular customer, hadn't said much beyond polite exchanges before. After a moment of silence, Martha reached into the small bag she had placed on her lap. She pulled out a small envelope, carefully sealed. This is for you, she said, holding it out to him. James frowned slightly. Ms. Wheaton, I can't accept. But she cut him off with a raised hand. It's not a tip. James, it's something more. Something I've been meaning to do for a long time. Please, take it. James hesitated, but finally reached out and took the envelope from her. Thank you, Ms. Wheaton, he said quietly, unsure of what to expect. He glanced at the envelope, noting how it felt heavier than a usual letter. Martha smiled softly. You deserve it, James, more than you know. He nodded in appreciation, then turned to go back to his duties. Though his mind was preoccupied by the unexpected gesture, he had no idea what it was, but he was grateful. As the night went on and the restaurant quieted down, James couldn't shake the feeling of Martha's words echoing in his mind. He had always prided himself on being a man of dignity, of serving others without expecting anything in return. But tonight felt different. He finally found a moment to step into the break room, where he slipped the envelope open, revealing the contents inside. To his surprise, there was a set of keys, a note, and a small card. The note read, James, these are the keys to my apartment. I want you to have it. I've lived there for years, and it has always been my sanctuary. I can't keep it anymore, and I don't want it to go to anyone who won't appreciate it. You've earned more than anyone could ever give you in tips. Please take care of it. It's yours now, Martha Wheaton. James's hands trembled as he read the note, his heart pounding in his chest. Martha had left him her apartment, a woman he had served for years, a woman who had always been kind, but never had he imagined she would offer him something so significant. He stared at the keys in his palm, overwhelmed by the generosity of the gesture. It was more than just a gift. It was a lifeline, a change in his life that he hadn't anticipated. James realized then that kindness, real kindness, had a way of coming full circle. He had served Martha with compassion and dedication, but it was her gratitude, her recognition of his worth, that was now giving him something far greater than anything he had ever hoped for. And as he held the keys in his hand, he knew that his life had just taken a turn, one he had never expected but would be forever grateful for. Martha settled into her usual spot by the window, her wheelchair positioned just so that she could gaze out at the quiet street below. The soft hum of the restaurant, mixed with the clink of silverware and the occasional burst of laughter from a nearby table, filled the air. James took her order with his usual warmth, his smile genuine as he leaned in to take the note of what she wanted for dinner. Roasted chicken tonight, Martha, he asked, gently lifting the menu. Yes, please, she replied, her voice a little weaker than usual. And a glass of the Cabernet. You know the one I like. Of course. James nodded, writing it down. I'll get that right for you. As he left to put in the order, James couldn't help but notice the way Martha seemed more distant tonight. Her eyes were slightly downcast, her usual bright, friendly demeanor replaced with a quiet, almost introspective air. He chalked it up to the long day she had probably had. After all, being in a wheelchair was a constant struggle. But there was something more, a subtle shift that James couldn't quite put his finger on. He only hoped that she was doing okay. When the food arrived, James placed a steaming plate of roasted chicken in front of her, along with a glass of red wine. Martha looked up at him with a soft, tired smile, her hand reaching for the glass. As he refilled her water, she paused, then turned her gaze back to him, a more serious expression on her face. "James," she said slowly, almost as if weighing her words, "I've been meaning to give you something." He furrowed his brow in curiosity. "What is it?" "Martha." She reached in her purse and pulled out a small, neatly folded envelope. It was unmarked, with no address or writing, just a simple, thick cream-colored paper. "This is for you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I want you to have it." James blinked, not entirely sure what to say. He wasn't one to get gifts from customers, much less something so unexpected. But there was a seriousness in Martha's eyes that made him take the envelope with a quiet sense of reverence. "Thank you, Martha," he said softly. But inside, a mixture of curiosity and confusion swirled in his chest. He waited until the end of his shift to open it, not wanting to distract himself while he worked. When the restaurant finally emptied and he was alone in the back, he sat down at one of the tables, carefully opening the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper, with handwriting in a graceful, yet hurried script. James read the note aloud in the stillness of the restaurant. "James, I've watched you for years, not just as a customer here, but as a person who gives of himself without question, who does the work even when no one sees, and who always remains kind despite the world's challenges. I know how hard you work, how hard you try to make everyone else's lives better. Yet I also know that, for all your hard work, you struggle to get by. The world doesn't often reward the people who truly deserve it. I've thought about this for a long time, and I want to offer you something. I may not have much, but what I do have, I want you to have. My apartment, my savings, everything I have is yours. I want you to have the opportunity to live the life you deserve, to not struggle every day just to survive. I know it's not much, but it's all I have to give. Please take it. James, you've earned it." Martha Wheaton. The weight of the words hit him hard, and for a moment, he just sat there, staring at the letter. His heart pounded, and his breath caught in his throat. Was this a joke? Was it real? James stood up and paced around the back room of the restaurant, his mind racing. How could this be real? A disabled woman, someone he'd known as a kind but ordinary customer, was offering him everything she had? It didn't make sense. But as he reread the letter, something inside him shifted. This wasn't a joke. This was Martha's way of giving back, of showing gratitude in the most profound way possible. He thought about his own life, how he had struggled to make ends meet, how he had worked tirelessly, sometimes not even knowing how he'd pay his bills at the end of the month. He thought of the long hours, the exhaustion, the feeling of being unseen. And here, before him, was someone who saw him. Without realizing it, a tear slid down his cheek. He wiped it away quickly, his heart swelling with a mix of disbelief and deep, profound gratitude. The next day, James went to Martha's apartment. He wasn't sure what to expect, but as he stood outside her door, his hand trembling slightly, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known he'd been searching for. When she opened the door, her tired eyes met his, and she smiled faintly. "James," she greeted him, her voice still quiet, but now carrying a softness. "I'm glad you came." "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for everything." Martha motioned for him to come in. He stepped inside, feeling a mix of awe and humility. As they sat down, Martha began to explain why she had made this decision. She spoke of her own struggles, how she had worked her entire life, but never really had anyone to share it with. And now, in her later years, she had realized something important: the value of kindness, of paying forward the generosity that had once been shown to her. James listened, amazed at her selflessness, and when it was time to leave, he promised he would make good on her gift. He didn't have to understand everything about why she had chosen him. He just knew he wouldn't waste it. The next few months were a whirlwind. James used the gift Martha had given him to start a new life. He moved into her apartment, began taking college courses he had once thought impossible, and found new opportunities to grow. And as for Martha, she remained in his life, no longer just a customer, but a dear friend. In the end, Elijah knew that it was never about the money or the material things Martha had given him. It was the act of kindness, the belief in him when no one else did, that had truly changed his life. And from that moment forward, James never stopped paying that kindness forward, knowing that one small gesture could be the spark that changed everything.